You are listening to Hysterics Unplugged.
What's the big deal when I'm doing it? Like, come on, you know?
And I always say, if it's hysterical, it's historical.
Because this cop is hysterical.
Hysterics Unplugged.
Weak men are afraid of strong women.
Louder, baby.
Hysterics Unplugged.
Yes, perfect. Okay, well then again, thank you so much for joining us for this interview.
My pleasure.
And I thought that we could start perhaps a bit with your earlier work and then move into your upcoming book, Patipolitics. And so in your first book, Psychoanalysis of AI, you look at the figure of the sex bot, the basically artificial intelligence embodied in feminine or female form. Through films like Ex Machina, Her, and Westworld. And something that really stood out to me is how you connect the figure of the sex bot with the concept of hysteria, and also how you describe the sex bot as this undead body that can enjoy but also suffer endlessly. And so for our listeners who might not be so familiar with your work or with psychoanalysis more generally, how do you understand this relationship between sex bots and hysteria? And also more broadly, what do you think these depictions of sex bots can teach us?
Massive question. Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for this invitation, and it's really nice to speak to you. And I've been reading through the questions, which are really interesting and exciting. So, I mean, what you just asked me is a really big question because it's sort of, I mean, it opens up so many questions in psychoanalysis alone, let alone in the domain of AI or the sex bot. And of course, I don't think we can go too much into explaining the Lacanian clinic probably because we will be here all day. But I'm sure your listeners are sort of quite savvy when it comes to psychoanalysis already. So in terms of the concept of hysteria, which I know you are sort of the theme of your whole enterprise anyway. So I'll take a lot of that for granted and just say that hysteria, I think, is obviously a really interesting psychoanalytic sort of fundamental concept that so much can be done with. And of course, not just in the clinic, people have looked at hysteria across many different sort of disciplines working with this concept. So for me, the interesting thing about it was the sort of what I felt was an obvious sort of epistemic category that was apparent in the figure of the sex bot as this kind of hysteric object. And, you know, we can think of immediately hysteria as being a symptom of the body or being a subjective structure. So that when we think of this figure of the sex bot, the first thing you can say is, well, this is an hysteric figure, of a sort of feminine hysteric figure that sort of exemplifies the typical cliched idea of the hysteric female questioning what is a woman, and by the same token becoming a subject by that question. What am I? You know, tell me, am I a woman? Am I not a woman? And that's the hysterics question classically in psychoanalysis. And another way to think about that is that in these films, often the figure of the hysteric is actually a symptom of the man's body. And that's also, you know, from Lacan, we get this idea that woman is a symptom of the man. And what you know, one might immediately go, well, that sounds misogynistic. But in a sense, talking about the sort of idea of woman as being a symptom of the masculine position, of the need to make the idea of woman exist, is the masculine drive. You know, the woman has to exist, which we know through psychoanalysis she doesn't really exist. She exists through this perpetual demand that she must exist somewhere for us because she occupies this fantasy role. And so then you have this sort of third dimension of the hysteric, which is actually the hysteric discourse, which of course is a sort of formalization through Lacan's idea of the four discourses that come up in Seminar 17, which is his way of trying to mathematize or put into symbols or transferable units of knowledge, ways of producing truth in various different discourses. And so he had these four discourses: masters, hysterics, universities, analysts discourse, which supposedly at any given time will represent various positions of the subject to the other, but underneath that is something like a truth and a product, and those four elements kind of rotate on this structure according to what particular discourse you might be inhabiting, and so the hysterics discourse is traditionally set up against the discourse of the master, which is supposedly the prevalent discourse of society, which is, the master's discourse tells us what we want supposedly to hear, and then truth is produced via this way. That's a simplification of it, but what's important here is to think, well, the hysterics discourse is the opposite from the master's discourse because it always questions any stable notion of truth. So it's always saying, okay, you're telling me that's the truth. No, it's not. I'm telling you it's not. So we can think of hysterics discourse as always being in a position of the revolutionary subject, or the subject who questions, or the feminist subject, or the anti-racist subject, or the insurgent subject who won't accept the master's way of doing things. So in that sense, it's a great thing. The hysterics discourse is a thing that we must have to keep the engine of change and society moving, right? Also, the hysterics discourse is, curiously enough, what we could say is the true discourse of science, in the sense of the theoretical sciences, that science never actually sits with the truth. Science is always a question of looking for something else and not being satisfied with the current conditions, and always having to test and make sure that what you thought was true isn't falsifiable. So rather than like the ways that sort of minor sciences we tend to think of as giving us the truth, actually the real sciences are the sciences that don't give us any truth, that make us have to constantly search and search and search, and which is where sort of science and philosophy kind of merge in a conceptual realm. So yeah, so all of those kinds of ideas of hysteria are present, I think, in this figure of the sex bot, because she is both a feminine symptom, and she is a kind of questioning of knowledge and a position of destabilization between sort of human ideas and supposedly man-made ideas of what come after the human, the artificial intelligence. So yeah, so that's how the figure of the hysteric started off. But you've dropped out now, the mic.
Now it works again, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Technical difficulties, apologies. Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's really interesting also the role that the sex bot plays in the sort of current AI master discourse. And you, as I mentioned before, you have a new book coming out later this year.
Yeah.
Called Patipolitics. And maybe to start, you could help explain a bit what you mean on one hand by the patipolitical,
Yeah.
and how this idea can help us make sense of the current moment that we're in. And I'm also curious how this book builds on the themes of your earlier work concerning the sex bot, and also what new directions it maybe takes on this topic.
Sure, yeah. So so the sex bot is this sort of conceptual figure that I use in the book to explore various dimensions of subjectivity and knowledge and truth and sexuality, primarily in the psychoanalysis of AI. And using these Kantian questions that I did of the, what can I know, what can we do, what should I do, what may we hope for, allowed me to explore various sort of dimensions of our sort of interaction with AI in this plane, and specifically the problematic of the positing of the sort of non-human sexual figure. What it does is it allows us to kind of delve into some of the fundamentals of psychoanalysis regarding the relationship between sexuation and knowledge, and also the body. And quite quickly you realize that so much of what the fantasies around AI, but also not just the fantasies, the actual sort of philosophical problems of AI are ones which tap into very deep and old problems of psychoanalysis, which is to do with, how we appropriate our bodies, how we understand ourselves as sex beings, how we are situated within language, and how language and enjoyment are sort of the beginnings of our entrance into the world, and how we kind of sew together our sort of sexual identities. And when you're kind of taking these extreme figures of non-human entities who supposedly inhabit some sort of sexual plane, you are sort of faced with something quite uncanny, because you realize that so much of sex is very strange, and it's something that we can't really explain, and it doesn't have a biological meaning, and it doesn't have a discursive meaning, and it's not something that can be completely taken up by any kind of sort of literary form. It's something that exists in this weird disjunctive plane, and so it's already a problem of psychoanalysis, the sex bot, in a way. It's not, in a way, it wasn't even a new thing. It was something that was kind of already there. It just opens up a problem that we hadn't really properly examined, in a way. And so one of these problems, you could say, is the ethical problem, the question of enjoyment and the body and the law. And of course, for psychoanalysis, the law and enjoyment are deeply bound, and the question of enjoyment really is one which satellites around our ways of trying to understand how the law, in terms of literally the law, but also more fundamentally the symbolic laws, the laws which govern our ways of interacting with each other socially, and in our familial relationships, and in our romantic relationships, and in our professional relationships, how these sort of unspoken symbolic laws, where they came from, and what they actually determine, because they really are underlying the way that we think of what supposedly has nothing to do with the law, which is our enjoyment and our pleasure and our access to sort of unfettered, sexual pursuits, whatever. And clearly those domains are very related. And Lacan knew this, and many other people have known this before him, of course, but he was interested in looking at, for example, the way that the desire and the law have this very strange relationship to each other. And he went through various stages of trying to work out how exactly the law and desire were related, and that it's not the same throughout his work. But one of the things that he looks at is the relationship between figures who are associated with the law, with the moral law, in our sort of literary and philosophical canons, which typically wouldn't have gone together. And those two figures were Immanuel Kant, the father of the Enlightenment, and the Marquis de Sade, who is the sort of famous French libertine writer who was famous for writing very explicit and obscene material. And what Lacan is interested in thinking about is how those two figures are sort of not just mirror images of each other, because that would be too obvious, but he thinks that in a way they play each other's role better than each other, so that Kant becomes this strange sort of philosopher of desire, and Marquis de Sade becomes a very formal moral ethical philosopher in terms of the way that they construct the law. So this kind of got me thinking about what it is that we're doing when we try and imagine pursuits of pleasure or sexual activities as separate to the law or as beyond the law, which you could say both Kant and de Sade are interested in. And one of those obvious things is, of course, this sort of notion of the sex bot as something which can be perpetually enjoyed or perpetually tortured or perpetually hurt. And they'll just keep coming back, and they're there again, and you can do whatever you like to them. And this is a sort of looming figure that we have actually in culture, but also in fiction, and also in our fantasies about what the future of AI holds. So it was already something that was sort of on the horizons that I saw, that was kind of, people were starting to think about, what does that mean? Why are we interested in that? And what does it do to human beings to supposedly have these cathartic objects? And lots of people made these arguments about it being a necessary thing to have some sort of catharsis, so that human beings, don't hurt each other. You have another form of being that isn't going to be hurt by your excesses, whatever, in this sort of Sardian way. So the seeds of Patipolitics started with trying to theorize what type of sociality, or what type of community is created around this bond of basically suffering, and the kinds of ways that the patipolitical, or the politics of suffering, patio from the Latin to suffer, has kind of become a modus operandi for so much of our interactions today. And so in a sense, the sex bot becomes just like a prism, or an analogy for many of the sort of more systematized forms of institutional sexual suffering that we encounter as a culture. So that's where it began, and then it started off in going off in splintering to quite many other directions over the last couple of years. But that's the beginnings of the next book. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I was also thinking about this idea of the cathartic object, and in which ways the sex bot also might already exist as a figure in culture today, thinking also about like the role that certain pop stars have taken in pop culture, and this idea or this desire to cause sort of perpetual suffering. I think of, for example, figures like Britney Spears, and sort of this cultural obsession with making the feminine icon suffer and expecting her to function fully the day after. I don't know if that's a way that the political framework can help to understand sort of these dynamics that I think you also see in pop culture more broadly.
Yes, definitely. I mean, in a way, we could say that the sort of the figure of the pop star, or the bombshell that you drew attention to in the questions that you sent me, is actually a sort of it seems like an old idea. Marilyn Monroe, the blonde bombshell, for example, sort of being one of the iconic figures that we watched kind of ascend and then implode, and her sort of existence on the scene as this amazing, sublime object that made everybody gasp, and then she kind of exploded in a sense herself, because it was too much for her to be the thing that she was. And that kind of idea, that logic, I think persists and has persisted ever since. I mean, she wasn't probably the first, of course, but like in terms of our sort of imaginary, she is one that we associate as being the first. And I think that desire to see the sort of archetypal image of the beauty and the sort of sexual plenitude of a woman in its most explosive and amazing forms that we are so fascinated by sort of necessarily entails this moment of self-destruction that it's in a sense that, you know, that's why are they a bombshell? They're a bombshell because they destruct. They blow up everything, and they don't just blow up what's around them. They're not just dangerous, but they're self-destructive. And so you can't, in a sense, you can't be that beautiful, that perfect, that sexual, that enticing unless you reach a point of sort of peak, and then you're gone. Because of course, if you survive beyond that peak, nobody fucking wants you. You know, you're you're not worthy of, you know, of social consideration. You're completely vilified, and you're so the only way to actually be a bombshell is to die when at the top. You have to go get to the top and then die, because if you go beyond, then what are you? You're nothing, or you're a landmine, aren't you? You're waiting to explode somewhere else, which is a slightly different logic. But I mean, I think that this this is what we continue to do. We always want to see is these sort of extremes, which then have to be taken down. They have to be demolished. And in a sense, technology is just allowing us to do that more efficiently and make the sort of feminine form a sort of a technology in itself that can be used as a weapon. So the bombshell is basically, it doesn't have a weapon, it is a weapon in that sort of like psychoanalytic logic of, you know, being or having. It is the phallus, it is the weapon.
I also thought about with what you just said about this idea of the invocatory drive from Lacan. So in your previous book, you also write about the movie Her, where the main character falls in love with this disembodied voice of the AI system, Samantha. And highlighting the role of desire in the invocatory drive. And it also made me think of Freud, who is at least thought to be very suspicious of music because how it like affects us emotionally. And in your paper on the Patipolitical century, you described this push toward wanting to see everything from the scopic drive, and how almost nothing can remain hidden or private anymore. At least that's how I read it. And yeah, for listeners who might not be so familiar with these terms, could you perhaps briefly explain what Lacan means by the invocatory and the scopic drive, and maybe how we see this tension between these two play out in contemporary culture, also thinking of this idea of the exposure of pop stars or feminine like icons in popular culture more broadly.
Yeah. Well, so for, you know, like Freud had his objects, right? So Freud had the oral, anal, and the genital objects, which became sort of cornerstones of understanding, you know, obviously psychoanalytic development, but more broadly the body as a set of drives. So and obviously oral and anal are quite self-explanatory when it comes to the drives that are kind of originated through the infantile first encounters with the breast, and then of course the feces as this kind of retaining and giving away sort of originary moment that the child sort of experiences in a sort of very bodily, visceral way. So these drives become very central to Freudian psychoanalysis, and Lacan, of course, takes them up. But he builds on that because he adds two other drives, which are the scopic and the invocatory, which correspond to the voice and the gaze. Because for Lacan, he thought that these were extremely central drive objects and things that we had to consider when trying to understand subjective structure. And so the gaze, of course, is an interesting one in psychoanalysis because it's to do with your eyes and to do with sight, but it's not exactly the same. It's something that doesn't quite correspond with the look and the actual line of vision, but something which is much more invasive and much more sort of dialectical than just simply a question of sort of a biological action. And the gaze is something which becomes a very significant part of trying to think about how one is sort of subjectively structured in terms of whether you're a neurotic subject or a psychotic subject. And the gaze can become something extremely menacing and extremely problematic. And it's something which we all are subject to, but we all have to kind of deal with it in different ways and sort of mediate how we cope with the fact that we are looked at all the time. And whether or not that look is an actual objective look from other human beings it's irrelevant. It's the fact that we have to present ourselves via the mirror image of the other person, and that means that we have to be drawn into the realm of the imaginary via the mediation of obviously our own reflection, but the fact that there is somebody else there who we see ourselves in, who makes us understand that we are a body in the same way that they are a body. And so this moment of trying to come to terms with the gaze of the other, which is, of course, first of all, the other being your immediate other, your mother, who is the first person there with you, then becomes sort of redoubled into the question of the gaze of, the whole of the rest of the world, and the sort of symbolic gaze of, the gaze of authority who's looking upon you. And of course, the internalized gaze of how you see yourself. And so all of these strange redoublings happen in order for us to sort of come to terms with the gaze. And there's much written about the gaze in psychoanalysis, of course, and psychoanalytic film theory and aesthetics, and how this plays a role in all kinds of domains. And of course, the other one is the invocatory object, which is the voice. And a voice is something really interesting in psychoanalysis, again, which is related to subjective structure, but and very importantly, psychosis, which can become a problem for people very much with psychosis. And the voice is an object which is strange because it's a non-material object. It doesn't actually necessarily have to exist phonically. It can be a hallucination, but it's still there. And the voice is something that we hear all the time, even when we're not actually hearing. And so it has this very important relationship to the law and how we position ourselves with morality and right and wrong and our sort of super egoic positions. So the voice and the gaze are always kind of dimensions that we encounter in culture. And you mentioned this idea of the question of the obscene and what the relationship is between these drives and our sort of current obsession with the kind of pornographic and obscene nature of our existence. And so yeah, I mean, you're right that I've spoken before about this sort of the proliferation of images and the obscenity that we currently feel because everything is images. We are sort of constantly in this panopticon of being watched, but also of watching other people. So it's this sort of voyeuristic succession of images that we're always being able to engage with. But I think the interesting point that you make here is about, what's the difference here between this the exposure to the visual realm as opposed to the invocatory. And I do think there is a question here of sort of public and private and intimacy, because I was thinking about, well, if we're always being looked at and we're always shown everything, we're either exposing ourselves or we're witnessing other people exposing themselves, whether that's literally in a sort of sexual way, or just the fact that we expose our lives all the time and nothing is sort of secret. But in a way that kind of like removes the subject. You know, the subject is just kind of this sort of plane of information just going in, which is constantly seeing all of this stuff, which becomes very unintimate. It's not intimate anymore, the things that we see. So in a sense, the intimacy of the image is completely gone. There's nothing kind of erotic in a sense, if you want to call sort of intimacy and eroticism, if you want to think of them as similar. There is no intimacy there because it's just exposure. And in a sense, that is the sort of masculine pornographic drive to see everything. And this is why somebody like Baudrillard saw a relationship between the desire to see everything in this kind of sort of formalistic and scientistic way of unpacking the secrets of the universe. He saw a relationship between this kind of obscene drive that kind of has its corollary in pornography and the sort of disintegration of our grasp of reality in a sense, because this complete like openness to everything that becomes so that there's no sort of ontological depth anymore. Everything is just there. He connects this a lot with hyperreality and with the kind of the disintegration of the real. So in that sense, that sort of ultra masculine exposure is the public, it's the ultimate public sphere. Whereas the voice here, because you talked about, you know, the idea of everyone's there with their little iPods in and they're having their very sort of intimate relationship to the voice. That kind of then becomes the place where we have our private realm, where we can go, okay, I'm coming into this, I'm closing the doors, it's just me and this voice. And, you know, hence why the voice has always been associated with, you know, a kind of confession or a more kind of religious experience of people feeling that they are alone with this other voice and no one else is present, and you can actually retreat into something which is private, which I think is very difficult to do at the moment. So perhaps that's something that is a kind of refuge, perhaps from the kind of overexposure, sort of masculine overexposure of everything else.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I find it's super interesting, this difference between the sort of exposure of seeing, also just in the way that we consume media today, even in the recent years, the shift of everyone having a podcast to sort of this shift to, I don't know, Instagram reels and this whole idea of having to be heard, you now first have to be seen, and what that does to us. I find it's super
Yeah.
interesting. And yeah, to go a bit back to also the topic of psychosis, which I also find really interesting in your work. But perhaps first to this idea of the Lathus from Lacan, because in your previous book you write about this concept, and I also find it really interesting to think about in relationship to music. Is exactly what you also just mentioned, this idea of having the headphones in, and this sort of as the first example of the Lathus was also the tape recorder. So yeah, maybe you could give us a quick explanation of what a Lathus is, and maybe also how it connects to Freud's idea of the prosthetic god, and how this fits into your patipolitical framework or paradigm.
Yeah. So the Lathus is a concept of Lacan's, which is only very briefly mentioned again in Seminar 17, but he's referring to tape recorders and the way that they are technologies which capture a drive object. They capture the voice, and then they go off and they are taken somewhere else, and so somebody could enjoy your voice elsewhere. And Lacan finds this interesting, and he uses this to try and start thinking about the technological object, which, you know, he doesn't talk about much, but it's there, where he he kind of sows the seeds of trying to think about what technology could be doing with psychoanalysis, and that's why I picked up that concept to then sort of take it away and do something slightly different with it, in the idea of the sex bot, and on the other ways that the drives can be in a way removed from the body, or augmented or diminished, or sort of interrupted. And I think this is the question of interruption, which is interesting. And if we think about, Freud's prosthetic God that you mentioned, he talks about in when Civilization is Discontent, isn't it? About the prosthetic God, and that the human is a sort of strange prosthetic being that puts auxiliary organs on itself and tries to make itself stronger and faster and better by using these other kinds of technologies to augment the vision and augment the hearing and various other things. But Freud already saw that this caused problems, and it didn't actually create this sort of totality of a body, or this more efficient body, or better body that we kind of constantly strive for. And of course, Bernard Stiegler takes this idea up as well, and writes a whole trilogy called Technics and Time, where he's focuses really on the sort of evolution of technology along with the human body, and goes deeply back into a sort of paleontological history to try and imagine and think about that relationship. And I think what the thing about the Lathus, why it's interesting, is because it's a way to think about how these auxiliary organs, which start off being like material things that we add on to the body, what they end up doing is they don't just change sort of biological functions. They interrupt the drives. They interrupt the way that we enjoy different things. They interrupt the way that we experience different things. And we can see that already happening with various with our interactions with obviously social media, but the types of media that we consume, and also the ways that we treat our bodies in relation to the kinds of technologies that are available. And at the moment they're in early stages, and we know people like Elon Musk want to insert chips into our brain to supposedly augment us in this sort of ultimate way. And the immediate thing that you think is, well, how do you know what's going to happen to the drives? How do you know how that's going to really change the human brain? Because messing around with the human brain in any way causes effects that we just cannot possibly predict. And that's why series like Black Mirror are very good at sort of trying to trace these ideas through, and find the kind of horrible apocalyptic and nightmarish scenarios that might happen when we are tinkering with our drives in that way. And so the Lathus, in a way, is a sort of a way of thinking about what happens when we're interrupting our drives, or when we're trying to do stuff to enhance our body and sort of siphon off our enjoyment. I.e., for example, the sex bot is like a sort of a giant Lathus in a way. What happens when we try and do that, and what are the sort of unpredictable effects that these can cause? And basically drawing attention to the fact that the human body is not just a set of biological functions, but it's a sort of discursive body that is beset with various drives and various libidinal kinds of ends, which don't have the good of the human being, the organism, as its end point. What they have is their own particular end which they're following, and you may just be the unfortunate passenger along this drive, but it's not the same thing. So that's what the Lathus is trying to kind of examine there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. And yeah, I'm curious. I don't know if you have any thoughts on like yeah, taking this idea into account of the first lethos being the tape recorder, and yeah, also this, as I was reading it, this idea of like what Lacan would have thought if he would have taken the subway today and seen everyone with their AirPods in, this very, yeah, very private way that we engage with music, that I think has also changed over time, from going to maybe gatherings or concerts, to having the speakers, to then having the headphones. It's also getting physically closer and closer to the body, which I find really interesting, the way we engage with it.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you have any thoughts, you can also take it in a broader direction on sort of the role of music in the Patipolitical, or its relationship to the lethos, or this idea of siphoning off the drive.
Yeah. I mean, we are approaching the sort of Adornian territory here, because clearly this idea of music becoming a kind of drive object, or a sort of object of the pursuit of a kind of semi addiction is quite close to the way I think that Adorno would have tried to critique the function of popular music, and in that it, instead of giving us the real experience of an engagement with a piece of music that allowed us to properly experience a sort of long form construction of something which was, in a way edifying and intellectual and had all these other sort of benefits musically, rather that the form of the pop song would just merely imitate a sort of childish lullaby that brought us into a certain feeling of comfort and familiarity. And that kind of instant capture in a sort of personalized familiarity of, everyone's sitting with their iPod, they've got their particular algorithm that picks out the things that the algorithm knows we're going to like, because we always like this particular type of riff, or we like these types of synthesizers, or we like this type of voice, and then we always get sent the same types of things, and so we kind of generate this alethosphere, or this self-contained bubble of truth. Alethosphere, another sort of Lacanian term, or sort of like a sphere of truth, a sort of self-contained sphere of truth, where we only kind of exist within a sort of particular small bubble of our own addiction, as it were, to a particular type of sonic feeling. And obviously there are many reasons why, of things that Adorno got wrong about music, but in terms of the idea about locking us in to familiarity in a way that sort of fetishize certain elements of music, as opposed to looking at it as a whole organism. He was interested in that kind of tendency that we all have, and we all do, whatever type. When we say popular music, we're actually talking about basically all music that is not classical music. So it's not just the narrow understanding of what pop is, but basically any music that is not. So this kind of tendency to always be drawn in to a certain affect that then you associate with a certain cultural milieu, which then you associate with certain memories, which then you associate, which is the whole of how we think about musical identity, and the way we think about why we like certain types of music and not other types of music, or why we go through phases of disliking certain things because they remind us of things. So in a sense, the sort of intellectual engagement that Adorno wants us to have with music is quite difficult, because we never really get to do that, because we're always making music a purely affective thing. And in a sense, Adorno doesn't want us to do that. And whether or not we say, oh, fuck off, like that's quite a different question. But there is something to be thought about that, because the reason why it's important is because if music is only affective and it just makes us feel something immediately, then it also can very easily become a tool for oppression, or a tool for for domination or a tool for making people do things or think things via this sort of incantation, literally. And that's why he didn't like. He thought there was no such thing as protest music, because if as soon as it becomes a catchy tune, you're not actually thinking about people being genocided. You're thinking, oh, I like this beat. You know what I mean? Like that's. He just thought they were completely. It just didn't make sense to put those things together. And so I think that there's clearly, obviously, the music industry is in many ways fascistic, and in many ways brings us into sort of dominates us into to kind of submission, a sort of submissive position of accepting certain things, because it lulls us. It sort of taps into our most sort of intimate kinds of drives
Mm.
of enjoyment. Yeah, and I mean, sorry, the question of fetish, because I was thinking about this question of fetish of you know Adorno's
Mhm.
essay on the fetish object, and because fetish, obviously, he's talking about it in Marxist terms, but also in psychoanalytic terms, they're slightly different things. And importantly, for in psychoanalysis, the fetish is the moment of being stuck in time, and so that the fetish begins when the child disavows the fact that the mother doesn't have the phallus and therefore has to put something in place of it. And so that's why, typically these fetish objects become, a shoe or a piece of clothing or something. But importantly, that it's not just the thing, it's the thing stuck in time, it's the thing frozen in time.
Mhm.
And so this question of the fetish, I think, is quite interesting when you think of it like that, about why, for example, the jingle is something fetishistic, because it kind of freezes us in this moment of time that kind of locks us in place and then makes us buy something, for example. So I just thought it's quite nice to think of it as like a literal fetish object in the sort of Lacanian sense.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Also, mentioning Adorno and his work on pop music, I was also thinking about it in relationship to psychosis, because he also writes this idea of the the top melody of pop music, exactly as you explained, having this very sort of banal structure, so it gives the sense of being able to own it, or being able to sing along. You can take it with you, and he says, like, put it in your pocket.
Mm,
And this made me think about what you wrote in your previous book about psychosis as this feeling of having the object of desire, the objet in one's pocket.
mm.
And also, yeah, maybe if you would like to speak a little bit about this shift that you mention in psychoanalysis of AI, from neurosis to what you term also ordinary psychosis, and maybe what influence that also has on the Patipolitical.
Yeah. Yeah, so, well, I mean, this shift is one which is diagnosed specifically by Isabel Millar, who is sort of the sort of leading figure of the new Lacanian school, and is Lacan's son-in-law. And he came up with this notion of ordinary psychosis in the 90s, actually. And it's one which is it's a clinical term, and it's not often sort of applied or used in kind of criticism or philosophy, and therefore people within the clinic may sort of say, well, you're not supposed to do that, or that's not appropriate, whatever. But that's always been done with psychoanalysis. People take out ideas from the clinic and they go and apply them, or think of them as sort of metaphors, or think of them as sociological ideas, whatever. And so ordinary psychosis is this notion of a shift, a sort of discernible shift that was being witnessed by clinicians, where they felt that their traditional ways of trying to do differential diagnosis, i.e., trying to figure out whether a analysand was a neurotic or a psychotic subject, which traditionally one has to find out by seeing whether there is foreclosure present. Foreclosure being the mechanism that the psychotic subject will have had in place through a sort of what we call the foreclosure of the name of the father. And again, I'm assuming a lot from your listeners, but I think they'll probably have some idea what I'm talking about. So this primary distinction between neurosis and psychosis is very important because obviously it orients the way that you treat an analysand, and it's really important that you find out whether foreclosure is present or whether the name of the father is present, right? Because it makes a difference from how you're going to understand this person's symptom and understand how they relate to their body and how they relate to language and how they relate to ways that you're going to try and intervene with the course of your analysis. And so that's why clinically it's significant. And so ordinary psychosis came about because it seemed to be that there were issues with trying to diagnose that made it so that psychosis was present in a way that wasn't so obvious as it had been before, and it wasn't so florid, it wasn't so dramatic, it wasn't so kind of clear cut. And so therefore the question of ordinary psychosis isn't necessarily a diagnosis of an individual person or position, but it's a research plan or research program or a sort of epistemic category that allowed clinicians to try and expand the category of psychosis in various different ways, because, for example, lots of things were overlapping with the questions of hysteria, for example, in terms of the relationship to the body. And so that questions that had previously been thought of as hysteric symptoms were being mistook, and actually there was foreclosure there, and so hysteria wouldn't have been a correct diagnosis, etc., etc. So ordinary psychosis becomes this research program, which then generates lots of research and analysis within the clinical field. And so what's interesting about ordinary psychosis is it tries to kind of think about a shift. It speaks to a certain shift in culture, because the idea being that we've kind of moved, obviously, as you know, psychoanalysis is a product of civilization. It changes with civilization, and it responds to political, cultural, historical factors. And so because there was a sort of waning, so to speak, of the efficacy of what you could call the name of the father culturally. And what does that mean? It means that in sort of broad terms, kind of observable, obvious conventions around religion, politics, truth, science. As these things became less reliable, this had its kind of corollary in the ways that certain symptoms were being experienced in the clinical field, and people were presenting with different types of symptoms, and that stands to reason, obviously. And so this move from neurosis to ordinary psychosis spoke to what was perceived as a sort of change in the ways that we relate to our anchoring within networks of kind of conventional knowledge and truth. And these have their effects in the way that the body is experienced, in the way that sociality is experienced, in the way that our subjectivity experienced. And so that this notion of the object in the pocket is a kind of development of what in sort of traditional psychotic terms would be this problem that the psychotic subject experiences with literally the fact of the object as the sort of the eviscerating object of desire. And if we think about it in terms of, well, the problem for a psychotic is how to mediate one's body as opposed to the other's body, and how to mediate one's enjoyment in the different zones of the body, and understand how that comes from outside and enters into us, all of these factors become very difficult for a psychotic subject experiencing a psychotic break, because they haven't been able to properly place themselves within a kind of network of reliable sort of linguistic structures that make them go, I am this person here, and and so ordinary psychosis had this way of trying to explain how these sorts of phenomena were popping up with people who typically wouldn't have always been diagnosed as psychotic because it wasn't so obvious. And the object therefore becomes this thing that is too close. It's too close, and it's so close that you can sort of have it in your pocket, because there hasn't really been a proper mediation between the subject and the object as that which is out there. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there's probably a lot of interesting things to be said about how that can translate today. Again, 40 years later, 35 years later, of what we would say is our current state of affairs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm, I have a couple of more questions, but I see that we're already 1 hour in, so I wanted to ask you first if it would be okay to go a little bit.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Of course.
Yeah, because also related to something you mentioned earlier in the interview about sort of also the changes that we see happening to um, sort of the perhaps destabilization of for example, gender norms through technological development, which made me think of a paper that I read recently in relationship to music, and it's about electronic dance music specifically. And in this paper, the writer, the scholar focuses on the concept of the fembot. This hypersexualized sonic creature, which the author puts in stark contrast to the cyborg ideals of gender fluidity. And the author writes that electronic music helps to, and I have a quote, alleviate the destabilization of stable boundaries brought about by technological innovation, and that one way it does this is by regenerating or reiterating gender norms via diva loops. And so diva loops are these exaggerated, hyper-feminized vocal loops, which are common in genres like diva house or porn techno. Yeah, the author sort of looks into how this reinforces pretty traditional gender norms. And so it made me think about your work as well, and how perhaps the political lens can help us understand things like the rise in anti-gender movements or transphobia today, and how these sort of reactionary reactions can be connected to broader technological developments. So yeah, I don't know if you
Yeah,
have any thoughts on this.
it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, again, the figure of, that's why I think the sort of ultra femininity of the sex bot and its and the kind of echoes of that through, pop culture ideals of the feminine ideal are articulating something which I think is central to our relationship with technology itself, which is that it gets us to sort of circulate around this sort of abyssal character of our relationship to what we can't know, and in a sense the sexual non-rapport that it's called in Lacan is this relationship of an impossibility of knowledge, and it's this disjunction that every subject has sort of going through its own self. You know, it's not that there's men and there are women and they're disjunctive. It's that we are all kind of sort of split between ourselves in our own identity and sexuality and ability to appropriate ourselves as subjects. And so this idea that there is a sort of always a desire to try and make something exist and make something whole and give a stability and a reality to what is a woman is something that I don't think is just the purview of kind of misogyny or masculinist discourses, but it's something that we all do, whether we're you know, coming from a very progressive and very enlightened idea about masculine and feminine positions and the ability of us to be non-binary and the ability of us to go from one sex to another or one gender another. Even if we are on that side of things, or even if we're a completely reactionary conservative person who doesn't believe that is possible and that is completely horrified by that idea, I think that there is this idea of the notion of woman that must exist, that is being made to exist all the time, and this figure of femininity is also very closely aligned to the notion of pleasure, and I think that there is a relationship between the pursuit of an ultimate form of pleasure, which one could say is the sort of emblem of the sort of traditional pornographic idea of the porn star, of this ultimately enjoying figure that is kind of insatiable, and that no matter what she does, she's going to carry on wanting to experience more pleasure. So, you know, and this is a sort of positive and kind of optimistic view of pornography, obviously, but in the sense that the figure of woman here is seen to be this ultimate jouisseur. It's just something that is constantly, you know, sensual and wanting to experience themselves experiencing sex, right? And so therefore the pornographic subject is one who is fascinated by this possibility. And so if we think about that idea as a sort of a placeholder for something that doesn't exist, of course it doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. Whether it's a male fantasy or not is, I think, not necessarily true. I think it's a fantasy of all human beings. And this is made to exist, and we see it all the time. And whether that's through masculine discourses or indeed, you know, trans ideas of femininity as well also project very hyper feminine, beautiful images of the perfect woman. And, you know, who is to say that in itself is wrong or misguided or inherently oppressive? So that's the problem, is that there is this crossing over of the idea of femininity which exists in this plane of fantasy. And the key to making it not oppressive is, of course, knowing that doesn't exist for anybody. It doesn't exist for any woman. It doesn't exist for any man. It is a fantasy, and it doesn't have to be related to the actual biological and anatomical human being. And that's why I think it's interesting about your the other thing that you were talking about, and to do with the figure of kind of the beautiful woman, or the kind of sex symbol in relation to the technology of beauty, and the fact that there's something now that has happened with beauty that I think changes our relationship to it, sort of ontologically, or if you want to say existentially, which is that it used to be, I mean, this is taking some liberties here, right? But it used to be that the beautiful woman in culture was one that had, by some contingent, you know, God-given or whatever moment of science or genetics, had beauty, and that was this sublime thing, and they just were born, and we all look and go, wow, and whether it's a model or an actress or whatever, and they can't really help that. That's just what it is. Whereas now our idea of beauty is something that you make or that you can achieve or that you can work for, or that you design. And so it has a completely different object, function, effect, because it's, in a way you could say, oh, it's democratizing beauty because it's something that anyone can really get. But of course, that's not true. But it gives the effect of democratization. It gives the effect of, well, if you work hard enough, if you want to look like this, you can. You just need to pay the right amount of, you have to pay enough money, or you need to do, you need to put yourself in a position where so it becomes your kind of duty in a way, and it also almost becomes a failure if you can't do it. So that you're having to achieve this thing, and it becomes part of sort of an entrepreneurial self, sort of very Foucauldian notion of beauty that really has nothing to do with anything previously we thought of as a sort of sublime, or the kind of inexplicable confluence of factors that lead to somebody being beautiful. It's almost like that doesn't exist anymore. What exists is, hard work and, finding out what the algorithm is. If you think about who the top supermodels are of the day today, they are people who have had a lot of work done. You know, but I can think of several models who are very famous that have had nose jobs and all various other procedures, and indeed trans models. And that's not to say therefore they're not as good, or therefore they shouldn't, this is not right, or that is value judgment, but it's simply to say it changes the way that we understand beauty, or that we valorize beauty. And therefore it also plays into all these other discourses around sort of misogyny and the sort of manosphere about what type of violence is aimed at people who pursue beauty, because it's not something that they just have, it's something that they've tried to get, or that they've achieved through work. So beauty and work then become related in this way that then plays into the whole masculine economy of achievement. And so you can see how for the sort of manosphere ideology of women being worthless, when they're working towards getting something such as beauty, which becomes an exclusive thing that they can have, which excludes other types of men, then they enter into this whole other economy of like value. So I think, yeah, it's definitely changes. Technology and beauty really do work together in a different way than we've previously ever seen that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, think I have a lot of thoughts and further questions, but keeping an eye on the time, I think I would go to a slightly different topic that I also would love to hear your opinion about. Because our co-host Laura was recently doing a piece on the music producer Susanne Ciani and her work with the Buchla synthesizer, and especially this module, which is called the source of uncertainty, that Ciani speaks a lot about, which introduces randomness into the currents and into the sound. And she speaks a lot about how this makes the the music sound more lively. And this again also made me think of your work in psychoanalysis of AI, and particularly Matteo Pasquinelli, but also more broad, this idea of the stupidity of intelligence. So I was wondering, maybe as a last question, if you could speak a little bit about this idea of error, the stupidity of intelligence. And I would also be really curious to hear if that's something that you develop on further in Patipolitics, and what could maybe be the role of error, or maybe even stupidity, in maybe also sort of countering or working against some of the negative impacts that we have in this political century.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So the thing about intelligence is that, of course, we don't really know what it is, and we have ways of talking about it that that associated with certain types of observed intelligence, or certain types of cognitive ability that lead to certain outcomes or that allow us to do certain things. And the kinds of intelligence that is often valorized, it are things that we're obviously associated with the STEMs subjects, for example, that if you can do math and science, or things that you can quantify, or things that can help build things in the world, then that's intelligence, which of course leaves out all of the other ineffable forms of intelligence that lead to things that you can't qualify, that quantify, that you can't measure, that you can't compare. And, you know, without going into detail, obviously most of the humanities, most of the arts, you can't quantify. But to say that those are not forms of intelligence is just ludicrous, and we know that, and it's obvious. I mean, so of course the beginnings of the sort of logic of intelligence, or the use of this term, are very associated with the IQ test, which we know to be something extremely narrow form of measuring human ability, which has obvious racist and sexist origins and sort of eugenic origins, and therefore doesn't give us a full picture in any way of a proper understanding of intelligence in any common sense term. But apart from that, apart from all the obvious ways that intelligence is misunderstood, there's something about intelligence which is by definition sort of a disjunction. It's by definition something which is an abstraction, which has a sort of dialectical sort of element of stupidity, which has to be part of it, which has a blind spot, which has a failure. And in human intelligence is in itself a sort of form of failures. And lots of forms of genius that we can think of are forms of failure, forms of interruption, forms of breaking something, forms of not understanding something. And you have to have those in order to generate new things. And also, in creativity itself, you have to have a failure in order to find a new way of doing something. So intelligence is literally has to have failure as part of it to even begin. Thinking of musical geniuses and thinking of the way that the body is involved within the creation of music, and the drives and the interruption of the instrument to those drives. And then, of course, another obvious one, comedy. Comedy is one of these forms of genius and intelligence which is so unquantifiable, but yet it literally proves how it's impossible to try and find an algorithm for, because you can't get much more anti-comedy than trying to find an algorithm for comedy. You know what I mean? So there are a million examples that we can think of, but one I want to obviously, because I have a personal investment in it, but one that I think that is really such an obvious one is to do with motherhood, and the fact that we're so used to saying things like, "Oh, I've got baby brain," when you have a baby, and afterwards you suppose you can't remember anything, or you're so tired, or you're so forgetful, or whatever. And this has become something that, of course, we're quite comfortable saying, and no one really takes it as a sort of offensive term. And to the point where you get articles in like The Economist of proving why there is the science behind baby brain, because they've discovered that there's a sort of diminishing of grey matter in the brain after postpartum when women lose capacity. And so it's basically just bolstering all of these misogynistic ideas about why women are inherently stupider than men. Basically, that's what they're trying to say. And I find this so funny because it's so obviously not true, but also that when you have a baby, you are spending all your time trying to keep another human being alive, which takes up all of your energy, all of your time. And not only are you trying to keep them alive, you're trying to do everything else that you did before. So you're trying to keep this person alive, but you're not just trying to keep them alive, you're trying to make them happy, you're trying to make them, a flourishing human being. You're trying to do all these things that you can't, you basically take out all of the things that you used to only have to do for yourself for another person who's completely helpless. And then you've got all of these other things of like the actual logics of the danger that you're always having to worry about that might come and hurt your child or, whatever. And so the whole sort of kind of architecture of your brain has to change because you're in a different mode. You're like in a fight or flight mode all the time, or you're having to be awake all the time. So everything sort of physiologically not only has to change, and obviously if you're breastfeeding, then all of that stuff that you're doing all day as well for however long you want to do it changes change your brain. So the fact that they can kind of find a sort of biological corollary to this by looking at some brain scans and saying, you see, they are stupider. But yet the evidence shows and proves that not only do women do all of this stuff and all the other stuff that they're doing, they excel and they create human beings and they make, they look after everybody and they, create love and create safety and create all of the amazing things that are forms of intelligence. So the plainly obvious thing that we can look at something and know that it's not true, but still we'll say, science proves that women get stupider when you have a baby. And I think that kind of logic to me is really so like emblematic of what the whole of the kind of tech bro attitude to what intelligence is really shows us, is that they haven't got a clue what intelligence is. They have this very narrow masculine idea of a particular outcome, and they forget the whole other massive picture that is actually has that forms one tiny little speck of it. And so in a sense, like that Patipolitics is the complete rejection of this narrow attitude to sort of the instrumentalization of our sort of subjectivity, sexuality, intelligence, which has come about in the age of artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Super interesting. I find it really interesting also, the relation to motherhood and this idea of what counts as intelligence, and I think we're also seeing that a lot in terms of music and creativity and what is replicable and not, and exactly what you also spoke about the role of the body, and for example, certain musicians now sort of how do you say, willingly or choose to implement more friction or more error into the process because it makes the creative process more interesting and makes it more dynamic. And for example, Imogen Heap, who puts the instead of just being at the computer, sort of puts the sensors all over the body to make music with the body. Super interesting.
That's so interesting, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really great. I would love to ask a lot more questions, but we're already way past the 1 hour. But yeah.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you so much. It was really great to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to hearing more of your podcast as well, because they're very good.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I can't wait to read your new book when it's out.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Then I wish you a really nice evening, and thank you so much for taking the time as well.
My
Really
pleasure.
appreciate.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Hysterics.